Animals and Morals by Roslind Godlovitch, taken from the book Animals, Men and Morals by John Harris and edited by Stanley and Roslind Godlovitch. Philosophers, like the majority in our society, tend to accept the conventional morality with regard to animals. This assumes that we have a weak duty towards animals which consists in not inflicting gratuitous suffering on them, and at the same time we do not owe the strong duty of justice to them. The duty of justice is owed only to those who can complain of not being justly treated. This, of course, animals cannot do. As for children, one supposes that the capacity for a sense of justice is there and only awaits development. Though it is not generally admitted that we owe animals humane treatment, we do not think we owe them justice. We can, without compunction, kill them for food and clothing or use them in scientific experiments. The view about animals runs alongside another generally accepted view concerning human beings. Whereas we think that a few animals may be sacrificed for the benefit of many humans, in reality it is often a great many animals for a very few humans. We do not accept this utilitarian reasoning with regard to humans and allow experiments which cause suffering and death to be carried out on a minority of our fellows in order to maximise the happiness of the remainder. Thus it seems that our moral principles differ substantially when we apply them to human beings and animals. All humans have equal rights, and all that is implied by equal rights. But we have only to treat animals charitably and with some consideration for their suffering. In this chapter, I am going to argue that if we are to hold genuine moral principles about animals, these will not differ in substance from those we hold about human beings. I will begin by looking at a common problem both inside and outside academic philosophical circles: the nature of a natural or moral right. It is not difficult to show that if humans have natural rights, then so do animals. In the second part of my essay, I shall examine certain principles concerning animals that are widely held, and show that they lead to absurd consequences. If my argument is valid, then our conventional morality is unsatisfactory on two counts. First, it arbitrarily discriminates, and secondly, it is incoherent. 1. Rights. Very few people today believe that rights have meaning only within a legal context. Good legislation, we feel, recognises rights, whether positively by protecting them or negatively by not trespassing on them. It is often when legislation or reform is needed that we appeal to the rights of those who are in some way excluded from our moral universe. This we could not do if rights just meant legal rights, for we would be appealing to something that didn't exist. There are, of course, other ways of making an appeal. R.M. Hare, one of Britain's eminent moral philosophers, follows the Christian tradition with its golden rule in using the argument from imagination. One is asked to conceive of oneself in the position of the individual toward whom a course of action is considered. One could not logically make any moral judgment that one would wish upon oneself were one in that position. In considering animals, however, some would protest that it is not impossible to imagine being an animal, since there isn't enough left of the person doing the imagining after the transference has been made. I think the confusion in this contention lies partly in overestimating what precisely needs to be imagined, and partly in the lack of familiarity which most of us share about animals. As Professor Hare put it, referring to the bear baiter, these people are not paying attention to the relevant similarities between themselves and their victims. If we like to revert to the metaphor, the bear baiter is not thinking of the bear as his brother or even his cousin. In any case, for our purposes, an advantage of discussing the strategy of recognising rights rather than applying one's imagination is that where some might object to Professor Hare's tactic, very few would refuse to grant that some animals have, at the least, a capacity for experiencing, i.e. are sentient and have an interest in the form their experience takes. To act on a basis of a recognition of another's interest is not necessarily to imagine being the other individual. In granting that someone has a moral right, one recognises his liberty to pursue those interests that are compatible with like interests of others. This essential feature of moral rights takes them, unlike legal rights, by their very nature unrestricted. The only condition that would need to be met in order to have a moral right is that one has interests, and this condition is met by all sentient beings. It is surprising then that many philosophers claim that it is meaningless to ascribe rights to animals, and indeed sometimes to children and the mentally disabled as well. H.L.A. Hart, in an excellent article are there any natural rights, limits moral and hence natural rights to adult humans. We shall do well to examine his reason for doing so, since his attempt is certainly one of the most sophisticated of its kind. As I shall show, however, even Professor Hart's arguments are fallacious. Before examining his position, I ought to distinguish between moral and natural rights. The latter bears an archaic name, natural, being more aptly conveyed by basic or logically prior. The difference then is roughly this. Assertions of moral rights, such as the right to pursue harmless pleasures, presuppose more basic rights. Ultimately, all moral rights rest on a presupposed right which is not itself grounded on a further principle. In other words, a logically necessary condition for something to be a moral right is that one presupposes another moral claim of great generality about beings, most importantly, the equal right to be free from constraint. This last principle is so rock bottom that it has been called natural. Those rights logically dependent upon this one we call moral rights. Professor Hart defines a natural right as being conditional upon the existence of moral rights. If there are any moral rights at all, if, for example, a man changes a certain law as being unjust because it violates a moral right he has, then there exists this natural right. If there are any moral rights at all, if, for example, a man changes a certain law as being unjust because it violates a moral right he has, then there exists this natural right. Any adult human being capable of choice, 1, has the right to forbearance on the part of all others from the use of coercion or restraint against him, save to hinder coercion or restraint, and 2, is at liberty to do, i.e. is under no obligation to abstain from, any action which is not one coercing or restraining or designed to injure other persons. A natural right is one which men have, qua men, and not only if they stand in some special relation to one another, and this right is not created or conferred by men's voluntary action. We are concerned here not with Hart's analysis of what a natural right is, but rather with his assertion about who would possess this right, for it is at variance with the very concept of a natural right that it has any unnaturally restricted application. If freedom from constraint is a natural right, it is the right of any individual capable of suffering from constraint. Since beings other than adult humans are capable of suffering from constraint, the restriction of the right to adult humans capable of choice is unwarranted. It's difficult to argue against any arbitrary restriction, except by pointing out that it is arbitrary, but it might clarify matters further to examine the types of reasons philosophers give for limiting moral rights to adult humans. After briefly showing why these reasons are inadequate, I shall indicate the specific source of Hart's confusion. 3 factors that are often thought to justify the restriction of rights to adult humans are as follows. 1. The relevance of choice. If one is to be constrained, then one must in some sense be capable of choice, for to be constrained is to be denied the liberty to choose. We often speak of choice in the sense that involves exclusively human capacities, such as prolonged verbal deliberation, and philosophers are prone to assume that this sense of choice is a necessary condition for the ascription of rights to an individual. But the sense of choice that is prerequisite for constraint to be possible is the preference sense, and this sense is shared by all sentient beings. Indeed, it is as sentient organisms that we instinctively want to live, and that we prefer certain types of sensations and certain modes of living to others. If these desires are respected in humans, then they should be respected in other animals as well. 2. The relevance of autonomy. One presumes that it is in the interests of other individuals to be free from constraint. In other words, that they are in a position to pursue their interests. Since children, idiots, and the insane are not capable for various reasons of autonomous existence, we wish to be permitted to constrain them in their own interests for reasons other than those considered permissible within Hart's definition above. But this is not to argue that children, idiots, and the insane do not have rights, and is in any case irrelevant for animals, since animals are perfectly adapted for an autonomous experience, for an autonomous existence. There is often a confused assimilation of animals to handicapped members of our own species. 3. The relevance of a capacity for obligations. The connection between a capacity for obligations and a moral right to liberty is a dubious one. Certainly anyone who is at liberty to do something is under no obligation to abstain from doing it, but it doesn't therefore follow that he must be capable of having other obligations. yet this is the step that would need to be taken in order to limit moral rights to those with the capacity for moral obligations. If we want to say, with heart, that children have no moral obligations, why can't we still say that they are at liberty to do anything that they are not forbidden to do, see 2 above, and that they have a right to that liberty? The points I have just counted are not explicitly spelled out by Hart himself. It seems, however, that much of what he has to say implicitly relies upon assumptions like these. Hart argues that we fall into the mistake of thinking that animals have rights because we have duties, the performance of which benefits animals. Our mistake rests on the careless use of the word to when we speak of duties to or obligations to animals. The distinction between obligations to and obligations about is made by the following example. X promises Y that he will look after Y's aged mother while he is away. Y, then, and not Y's mother, possesses certain rights, although it is the mother who stands to benefit by X's performance. So with babies and animals, the moral situation can simply and adequately be described by saying that it is wrong or that we ought not to ill-treat them, or in the philosopher's generalised sense of duty, that we have a duty not to ill-treat them. We can see Hart's confusion here. If we consider what point he intends his example to make, it is important, he says, for the whole logic of rights that while the person who stands to benefit by the performance of a duty is discovered by considering what will happen if the duty is not performed, the person who has a right, to whom the performance is owed or due, is discovered by examining the transaction or antecedent situation or relations of the parties out of which the duty arises. These considerations should incline us not to extend to animals and babies who it is wrong to ill-treat the notion of a right to proper treatment. It is significant at this point to recall that a natural right is not one which men have because they stand in some special relation to each other, and that this right is not created or conferred by men's voluntary action. As Hart's example depends on looking back to a transaction, it is apparent that his argument can only apply to what he calls special rights, in which there is an element of rights and duties arising through transactions, promises, contracts, etc. Hart's very own definition of natural rights is opposed to and more basic than special rights, denies the possibility of a transaction or conferring element in the right. Hence the ability to enter into a transaction is a necessary condition only for having the sort of special right that arises out of the transaction. Surely the right not to be ill-treated would be an instantiation of the right to be free from constraint, and so would needs to be considered a natural right. All Hart has proved, and indeed all that anyone can prove, is that animals and babies cannot sign contracts. His objection to ascribing natural rights to them is rendered invalid by the very nature of the concept itself. It is true, as a matter of fact, that there is a humans only connotation in the concept of a natural rights. Natural rights are sometimes even referred to as human rights. But the connotation is one we have posted onto the concept, much as whites only signs are posted outside public toilets in South Africa. 2. Some principles and their consequences. So far, my discussion has been limited to the vocabulary of natural rights. Since I am not assuming any objective position of ethics in this essay, statements about animals having natural rights can only be put in the conditional. If one does accept that there are any moral rights at all, then animals have the natural right to be free from constraint. I should like next to consider principles that do not use the language of rights, but which are held out of direct consideration to animals. One can think of many examples of principles that contingently relate to animals. One could believe that it is wrong to kill animals if they are someone else's property, or that it is wrong because it would have adverse psychological effects, such as promoting a tendency to violence among men, or at least hardening the heart. These principles do not treat animals as worthy of moral concern in themselves, but only by their efforts on men, and I shall not be concerned with them here. Of course, any of our principles may conflict with others of a higher order. If I believe that it is wrong to steal, then I believe I ought not to steal, all other things being equal. This general belief is not destroyed by the fact that I can envisage circumstances in which I would steal, nor does my being able to envisage these circumstances entitle me to steal when they do not obtain. So if someone recognises an animal's right to be free from constraint, he violates this right, he must offer a moral justification for doing so. This is quite different from his having an excuse for having violated the other's right. e.g. that he did so unintentionally or that he was temporarily insane. English lawyers once distinguished between excusable and justifiable homicide, and while this distinction is now blurred in the law by the use of the concept of mitigation, it remains of great importance in moral discourse. I infringe upon your right justifiably only when I have good reason for doing so, or to put it in other words, when I have another moral principle that overrides my duty to respect your right. The compulsory quarantining of a person's carrying infectious diseases can be seen in this light. To restrict a person to his rooms and prevent him from going about as he pleases certainly constitutes restraint. While we would not be sympathetic to such restraint where no reason were given, or where the reason given were he is being held hostage, we do agree that action is justified if he is carrying a contagious disease which would endanger the lives of others. It is more important, we could say, that the lives of others are not endangered by this man than that this man be allowed the freedom of going about as he pleases. We are not revoking his freedom absolutely, we are simply allowing that it be overridden. That we sincerely continue to respect his right to freedom from constraint can be seen in various ways. We choose the action that constrains him least, that is, we confine him to rooms for the necessary period rather than kill him. We lift the quarantine as soon as the danger is over. We do take the matter as license to remove all the pornographic and subversive literature from his bookshelves. In other words, we alter his situation only in those respects demanded by the overriding principle. It is also relevant here that the element of one's own convenience carries no special weight in moral decisions. Some philosophers would hold that convenience is irrelevant only for angels and not for mere mortals such as ourselves, but they tend to illustrate their point with examples in which is disregarded for convenience's sake is a very unimportant matter, or in which the inconvenience is so great that it verges on impossibility. It is when one comes to think of non-trivial examples that one realises the limitation of their remark. If the man who carried the contagious disease were rendered harmless in the most convenient way, say by being killed, rather than in the way which was most compatible with his right to freedom from restraint, we would doubt the sincerity about morally valuing his rights at all. So too with animals. To allow that some mild inconvenience to ourselves can cancel out our obligation to them is to betray how little regard we actually have for them. It is, then, granted that we may act in a way which is contrary to our moral beliefs, but barring special explanation or excuse, such action at least throws doubt on the sincerity of our belief. With this in mind, it is worthwhile to consider the practical consequences of our holding or denying different combinations of the following. The greater value principle. Human life is more valuable than animal life. The no-killing principle. It is wrong to kill animals when there are no overriding considerations. The no-suffering principle. We have a duty to prevent or not to cause animal suffering. The first principle differs from the latter two in several respects, and I make note of it here only to acknowledge the very great value placed on human life. All I shall have to say further on is compatible with human life being valued more highly than animal life. The greater value principle cannot be interpreted as arising out of equal consideration of human and animal interests, since there is nothing to indicate that an animal values its life any less than a human being values his. It appears as a guideline for crisis situations rather than a principle in the ordinary sense. It presupposes two principles: human life is valuable and animal life is valuable, and then offers a decision about priorities. It must be emphasised that the sense in which it does this is the same sense in which the welfare of a loved one would be valued more highly than a stranger's. This parallel proves embarrassing when one tries to interpret the fact that human life is valued more highly in such a way that it justifies sacrificing animals' lives to improve the quality of human life, or sacrificing animals in the possible hope of saving human life. But whether or not we do accept this interpretation, it is clear that the greater value principle implies that some value is placed on animal life, and hence that there is some restriction as to what sort of reasons must be offered in order to take an animal's life. Of course, I may say trivially that human life is more valuable than the pebbles on the beach without intending to imply that I place any moral value on the pebbles on the beach. I am assuming that the greater value principle isn't meant to be whimsical in this case. The no-killing principle. As soon as we attach moral importance to the taking of an animal's life, we are committed to the defending of any instance of killing an animal by invoking a moral principle or overriding importance. Most obviously, one would have to morally justify the practice of killing animals in order to eat them, which is no easy task. The difficulty here is of course particular to individuals in society such as ours, in which there is ample choice of adequate foods. Before concluding that we don't care a whit about the no-killing principle, and hence that human life is more valuable than animal life, is said whimsically, we might consider two strategies that are open to us in trying to overcome this difficulty. The first might go like this. 1. The food principle. To the no-killing principle can be added except when they are being killed for food. The oddness of the food principle lies in what one might technically call its fanaticism. Professor Hare, in Freedom and Reason, presents a rather brilliant example of the logic and fanaticism which is relevant to our consideration here. His concern is with attacking the position of the racialist or the Nazi. According to Hare, the racialist can hold principles that, though they may be considered repugnant, meet certain formal conditions for being called moral, rather than claim that such principles are formally illegitimate, as other philosophers have done. Hare argues that the objectionable feature of them is that they work against the interest of other persons, for the Nazi does not think that Jews should be exterminated in their own interest, in the pursuit of the quasi-aesthetic ideal. I can do no better than to expose the limitation of the food principle by juxtaposing it with Hare's fanatical trumpeter. Suppose that B says, I am not indeed prepared to prescribe universally that people's likes and dislikes should be disregarded by other people, but I am prepared to prescribe universally that they should be disregarded under a certain specified condition, viz., when they interfere with the playing of a trumpet, that noble instrument. This position may be logically irrefutable, but it is plainly silly, so also the following position is no different. Suppose that B says, I am not indeed prepared to prescribe universally that animals' lives should be disregarded by people, but I am prepared to prescribe universally that they should be disregarded under a certain specified condition, viz., when they interfere with the practice of eating meat, that noble practice. The second strategy I alluded to above involves incorporating a taste for meat into some more general policy statement. 2. The pleasure principle. Where any human enjoyment is derived from the result of an animal being killed, the killing is justifiable. It would be possible to legislate as to what shall qualify as legitimate enjoyment, relegating the pleasure principle to the same status as the food principle and the subject to the same criticism. Alternatively, we may leave it open to the individual to find his pleasure where he may. Two further difficulties emerge. First, since that it gives pleasure is held to override the prohibition against taking animal life, and since moral principles can be overridden by other more important moral principles, we are involving ourselves in a system of values in which the pleasure an action affords one is morally significant. The utilitarian would agree that an action resulting in more pleasure than any other is morally significant, but then he would at the least weigh the pleasure in eating a chicken against all the pleasures the chicken could have in living. Not so in our case, for any human enjoyment must justify the killing, otherwise the scales would probably tip in the chicken's favour. At the one extreme, it may be that one's own pleasure is the only consideration in deciding the rightness or wrongness of an action. This position is commonly called egoistic hedonism. Such a system allows for no moral principles about animals, its only value being, we ought to do only those things we enjoy. It may be, though, that one's enjoyment of an act is one moral consideration among many, so the fact that it is pleasurable may not weigh enough when considering, e.g., taking a human's life. To judge the importance of not killing animals in this system, we need only to ask what other principles can be overridden by the pleasure principle. I would venture to guess that in the moral system roughly shared in our society, it would seem that if one were to include a value on animal life in a hierarchy of moral values, it would be at the least important, the second least important being one ought morally to do what gives one pleasure. It would also follow that any other value that cannot be overridden by the pleasure principle can override the value of animal life. Say someone does not consider himself morally justified in lying in instances in which it gives him pleasure to lie. He may lie anyway, since he finds it trivially immoral. The only important feature is that he will not feel morally justified. If this person were asked to kill an innocent dog and report back when this is done, to be consistent, he would either kill the dog or report that he hadn't, rather than lie that he had killed the dog in order to save its life. In any case, there does seem to be some legislating as to what shall qualify as an enjoyment, for in fact all reasons for killing animals are not considered by many to be equally valid. Even if all the killings have equally pleasurable consequences, the fact that shooting wolves from a helicopter might give a sportsman a great deal of enjoyment doesn't vindicate the activity with a large number of people. Yet it seems no crueler than what is done to animals for food. The objectionable aspect might be that it is useless. By useless, one can't mean unnecessary, since eating meat is unnecessary. Perhaps it is wasteful. Some might feel that skinning a seal and leaving the carcass to rot or killing a fox is wasteful. Such thrift does not usually take on this moral significance. The objections that are raised to these killings would be more sincerely expressed as aesthetic objections. The most interesting position, and if we are to be honest, the one most often believed, is that it is not wrong to kill animals, but to cause or allow their suffering is wrong. I will now show that this position is untenable. The no suffering principle. This is the principle adopted by many who nevertheless want to avoid the consequences of valuing animal life, such as vegetarianism. In formulating it, I distinguish between preventing animal suffering and not causing it. I realise that these two can hardly be conceived as absolutely distinct from each other, but it is fruitful to look at the consequences of each taken separately before turning to see how the distinction breaks down. Admittedly, one is departing here quite radically from the type of recognition of moral rights that I discussed in section 1. Hart echoes our ordinary conception of what freedom from constraint means, and when he includes it in freedom from any action decide to make exercise of choice impossible, and so includes killing or enslaving a person. But we cannot reject the combination of valuing suffering but not valuing life out of hand, simply because it doesn't accord with the analysis of moral rights. It can be claimed that, for example, Hare's argument from imagination admits the painless killing of other individuals if they are not aware of the fact that they are being killed, since one cannot meaningfully ask, how would you like it if you were killed painlessly and weren't aware of it? I think this claim depends on an unfair simplification of Hare's position, but even though it may not be Hare's position, it can surely be held by somebody. Although it seems coherent, absurdities follow from holding that animal suffering is to be avoided but denying that animal life has value. For if a man were to consider it his duty to prevent animal suffering without holding that animal life has value, then it would follow that he ought to exterminate all animal life. It seems an inevitable fact that all sentient creatures suffer to a greater or lesser extent at some points in their lives. Suffering is accepted as a concomitant of living, and as such, except perhaps for extremely severe and prolonged suffering, is considered worth tolerating. But it is considered worth tolerating because a value is placed on living. The issues involved in euthanasia make this point clear. The dilemma can be crudely stated as weighing the value placed on life up against the negative value of suffering. Since we place a great value on human life, the problem of euthanasia concerns itself with cases in which the suffering is extremely prolonged or intense or intolerable. The lower the value placed on life, the less severe need to be the suffering in order for it to be justified to take the life, provided, of course, the negative value placed on the suffering remains. When the moral value placed on life is zero, as a rejection of the no-killing principle would indicate that it is with animals any amount of suffering would be sufficient to render obligatory taking the animal's life in order to prevent the suffering. When the moral value placed on life is zero, as a rejection of the no-killing principle would indicate that it is with animals, any amount of suffering would be sufficient to render obligatory taking of the animal's life in order to prevent suffering. The reason for this absurd consequence is that we have refused to grant an animal's life has value capable of overriding some actions that could be taken to prevent suffering. It is for this reason that philosophers cannot draw analogies they may wish to draw. For example, between our reaction to instances of animal suffering and our reactions to human problems such as euthanasia, it is not support for mercy killing as we understand it that follows from our moral attitudes towards animals, but something more like this. Say your doctor holds that human suffering is to be avoided, but that human life has no value, and you complain to him of stomachache. Say also that he cannot cure your stomachache. The rational alternative open to him would be to painlessly kill you. Of course, you might argue that the suspicion that he might kill you would cause you even greater suffering, so that this would be an unwieldy combination of principles to hold for human beings, but this is to assume that one cannot hold one's own life to be valueless, and this is not obviously true. Whereas the principle of preventing suffering invokes action, the principle of not causing suffering requires abstaining from action. More specifically, it involves not performing any action in which suffering is a possible consequence. To ensure that one does not cause animals to suffer, it is automatically sufficient that one abstain from directing any action whatsoever towards them. Of course, there are various degrees of likelihood that different actions will cause suffering, and if the likelihood were almost nil, we would feel justified in performing the action. It seems inevitable that in the process of killing animals, of keeping them in order to kill them, we cause them a certain amount of suffering. When you add kill economically and so that they are fit for human consumption, it becomes even more likely that they will suffer. It would seem then, if we are concerned simply not to cause them suffering, that we ought not to rear and kill them at all. It is illegitimate to argue in this respect that the suffering animals do undergo is less than the suffering that they would undergo if we did not act as we do. This is often the justification offered by hunters, livestock farmers and some conservationists, for this would be to argue that we are preventing suffering by causing a smaller suffering, and, as I have shown, so long as we deny that animal life has value, the consequence of our wishing to prevent animal suffering is that we totally eradicate all animal life. There may be aesthetic considerations in favour of culling rather than total eradication, just as pruning a tree may have more beautiful outcome than cutting it down, but this is to cease to consider animals as moral subjects altogether, and the arguments offered by hunters, livestock farmers and conservationists are masked as moral arguments. There is an analogy that throws some doubt on the argument that if we believe it is wrong to cause animals to suffer, then we ought not to kill them at all. It goes like this. In driving a car, there is a distinct possibility that we kill or injure another person, but we don't see this as sufficient reason for not driving. However, the American lawyer Ralph Nader has rightly pointed out that we ought to see this as sufficient reason for not driving, in circumstances where this is a distinct possibility, and certainly our error in judgment in this instance wouldn't exonerate us in the other. Admittedly, there is a parallel to manufacturing safer cars, though the practical obstacles to having as few mishaps on the farms and slaughterhouses as we could have on the roads might be insurmountable. But surely with cars we as a society choose to accept a small degree of risk and assume that the risks and benefits are equally open to all. But with the animals, the degree of risk is imposed upon them and entirely for our benefit. In any case, the whole argument that one can meaningly speak of simply not causing suffering is spurious, since the rigid distinction I have drawn between not causing suffering and preventing suffering is an artificial one, depending as it does on the complete separability of acts from omissions. If a man sees a baby drowning in a foot of water and fails to rescue it, it can still be said that in certain cases that he has not caused the baby any harm. We'd have no reason to deplore his failure to act if we held that only actions which themselves caused harm were to be avoided. It is clear from this example that there are certain instances, call them instances of gross negligence, in which the failure to take preventative measures against someone else's suffering harm is culpable. If we allow that we can be grossly negligent where suffering of animals is concerned, and continue to hold that animal life has no value, then we are back to the absurd consequence that resulted from considering that we have a duty to prevent animal suffering. Only this time, one must modify the principle from one ought to exterminate all animal life to one ought to kill all animals whenever the opportunity to do so presents itself. The man who fails to rescue the infant is grossly negligent because the opportunity for him to do so is patently available and because presumably a moral value is placed on the infant's life. He is not morally responsible for all infants that drown in a foot of water, but it still remains desirable that no infants drown. So also one cannot be considered responsible for animals one had no opportunity to kill, but it would still remain desirable and ideal that all animals be killed. And just as one can educate the public on how to avoid infant drownings, so one could educate the public on how to maximise the number of animals killed. A certain amount of the public fund could be allocated to animal destruction commissions. Private charities could be set up if it were felt that the government weren't doing enough. Summary. In part 1, I argued that there is no reason to deny that animals can be proper subjects of moral rights. Any ethical system which makes use of such a concept is bound on grounds of consistency to consider what the natural limits of the application of the right would be. Professor Hart indeed makes this not merely a point of consistency, but true by the very nature of his analysis of what a natural right is. If we substitute being that can suffer from constraint for adult human being capable of choice in his definition that I have quoted above, We see that it is natural rights are not created or conferred by men's voluntary actions. There is no reason to suppose that only men are subjects of natural rights, and every reason to suppose that they are not. In using the concept of rights, we cannot separate an individual's right to live and his right not to be caused suffering. Certainly, though, other principles can be formulated that consider these individually. Part 2 was devoted to considering the following principles that might be held with regard to animals. Human life is more valuable than animal life. It is wrong to kill animals. We have a duty to prevent or not cause animal suffering. The first principle does no more than state our priorities. It does not follow from it that animal life has no value, and hence we always have to justify taking it by invoking some greater value. The no-killing principle was found to be problematic since animals are killed for meat, but when we examine the consequences of refusing to accept the no-killing principle, we find that it does not make sense to morally care about the suffering inflicted upon other animals unless some value is placed upon the lives of those animals. A reductio ad absurdum follows from value in suffering, but not value in life. In another context, this absurdity is taken as self-evident. I have in mind a comment made by Richard Wasserstrom, an American professor of law. Imagine a society that has the same moral beliefs and legal prohibitions as we do, but with one exception. Murder is not a crime. It is impossible to imagine such a thing. Yet it is roughly the position that the more humane among us expound for other animals. Progress in animal welfare has come to mean the adoption of more painless methods of slaughtering animals, and it is not thought absurd that the RSPCA spends a considerable amount of time and effort killing unwanted but perfectly healthy cats and dogs to prevent cruelty.